Okay, welcome to this year's Shavuos shir. It's entitled True Greatness, and I've taken it. It's based largely on the very final chapter of Rabbi Emanuel Bernstein's Sefer Kul of Sinai, which is dedicated to Shavuos, Matan Torah, Megillas Rus. I feel a little, although I'm basing it on that, it is the very last chapter in his magnificent Sefer. So even for those of you who are working through it, hopefully you won't get to the last chapter. But I'm taking some of his ideas and elaborating on them. So if you're listening online, please email me at j.golker@gmail.com. I'll send you the handout. I want to focus not on the first parak, which a lot of people focus on, but on the second parak. And it's an interesting thing. The second parak begins, we know that the story began with Naomi married to her husband with 2 children, and her life implodes. She finds herself in Perek Beis without a husband, without her children. Poverty abounds, and her life is very different to that of Perek Aleph. Let's begin there. Naomi Moida, and Naomi has a relative, Leisha, a relative of her husband, Ishki Berchal Mishpachas Elimelech Ushmoi Boaz. That there's a relative, a person called Boaz. Now we know Boaz was the head of the Sanhedrin. He was the Gadol Hadar, and he was related to Naomi's late husband Elimelech. V'atomer Rus, pasuk beis, V'atomer Rus ha'mavi al Naomi elchana asodeh, I'll go to the field, v'elkat v'alakto b'shibolim, and I'll pick and I'll harvest the crop there. Asher emtzochein be'enov, maybe I will find favor in his eyes. V'atomer lo lechibeti, and Naomi says to her daughter-in-law to Rus, go. V'atelech v'tovoi v'tlaket basodach rakoitzim. Now the next 2 words are very telling. Vayiker mikre, achelkas hasod levoyaz. And Rus chances upon the fields of Boaz. In other words, there were loads of fields around, and the aniyim can go into the fields and can take the leket and the shikha, as is the halacha, the leftover pieces, small amounts of forgotten pieces. And of all the fields she chanced upon, it was Boaz's field, Hashem Mishpachas Elimelech, who was related. And then, V'hinei Boaz bo mebeis lechem, and then all of a sudden, chance, as it were, would have it, Boaz shows up, V'yomer l'koitzim Hashem mochem, V'yomer lo yivrech Hashem. So, Mikra, which is normally associated with Megillas Esther, is very pronounced here too. You see it in the opening psukim. Number 1, Vayikar Mikra Chelkas Hasod Levoyaz. Rus happens to choose Boaz's field. And then second of all, V'hinei Boaz bo mebeis lechem, that Boaz happens to choose that day to visit his field. And that's when he meets Rus. So he notices her. Now, Rabbi Bernstein is basing his essay on the Nachlas Yosef. If you look at the second box on the page, Nachlas Yosef on Megillas Rus, his name is Rabbi Yosef Lefovitz, and he says the following: V'hinei Boaz bo mebeis lechem. Hamila v'hinei. The word v'hinei, Boaz came from Beis Lechem. Bo k'yodu ala hadgish she'ire dovo sheyesh bo chidush. It's telling me something novel. K'nireh shelo ha'darka she'Boaz lo v'lesodeh b'zman ha'kotzeh. It seems to suggest that Boaz wouldn't ordinarily come to the field in the harvest time. V'hinei bo, and then today of all days, Boaz shows up. And because of that, because Rus had happened to have chosen this field, and because Boaz happened to have shown up on that day, they meet each other. Without this meeting, when Boaz noticed the milas, the wonderful virtues of Rus, then it wouldn't have been possible really for Naomi to suggest this union, this shidduch later on. So that's the first point. The first point is that it's not just Megillas Esther that has the theme of Mikra, but very much in Megillas Rus, it is an important feature of the Megillah, that Rus, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu ultimately is puppeteering from on high and orchestrating events, that Rus chooses this field, Boaz happens to come on that day, they see each other, and then the whole story unfolds. Now, that's point number 1. Point number 2, there is a remarkable contrast between Perek Aleph and Perek Beis of Megillas Rus. Megillas Rus is the most beautiful Megillah, very short, only 4 parakim, but the contrast between 1 and 2 is striking. Perek 1, chapter 1, is global. You have epic events. You have historic decisions. You have Elimelech, the leader of the Jewish people, abandoning his country and sneaking off in the middle of the night with his 2 sons. You've got, as Rabbi Bernstein calls it, tragic and tempestuous decisions. You've got the death of Elimelech, you've got the death of the 2 sons of Elimelech and Naomi, and then Rus, the daughter-in-law, and Orpah have got very difficult decisions to make. Orpah ultimately makes a decision, she turns her back on the Jewish people, and Rus cleaves to the Jewish people. So you've got major life decisions. You've got famine, you've got death. It's sort of a global, macroeconomic type of picture. That's Perek Aleph of Rus. Now, contrast that to Perek Beis. Perek Beis is just mundane, everyday life. We're told where Rus went, how much she gleaned, how much food Boaz gave to her, what was left over that she could take back to Naomi. These are sort of, very small microeconomic events. Very, compared to Perek Aleph, it's just quite mundane. And the message, says the Nachlas Yosef, is, however, very, very powerful. And let's take a look at the 3rd box, paragraph 2b. Essentially, the Nachlas Yosef is going to say that true greatness is behaving with greatness in all of life's situations, big and small. Let's see. It seems that the author of Megillas Rus is threading together very small details to create the whole story over here. Where she went, Yeshivasa, where she stayed, Achilasa, her eating, Ulam ba'itchanu toifsim rak es hagadlus, es hagdulos. But rather than seeing the sort of the greatness, when we see the greatness, Roye ayin shel male el gdulas ha'adam dafka b'ktanas. Whilst we may look at the headline-grabbing events when we try and determine what greatness is, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks actually at the small events. Kedivrei Chazal, like the Medrash Tanchuma says in Shmos Rabbah and Perek Beis, Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu noisen gedula la'adam ad sheboitzkeu b'davar katan. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is only going to bestow greatness on a person after he tests him on a small matter. Va'achar kach ma'aleh l'gdula. And only then would he rise to prominence. Where do we learn this from? Says the Nachlas Yosef, Moshe Rabbeinu. From none other than Moshe Rabbeinu. Why? After he's tested on the big picture things, on the mysterious nefesh, do these tests, go into Paroi. But he was first tested on small things. But so in Yisro, on the sheep of Yisro. How would he deal with the seemingly small things? That he would take them into the midbar away from any possibility of theft, of gezel. For time shel dava, and the reason is ki maisim gedolim, the big things sherishay mamnika, which everyone reads about. Maybe it's the stage, it's the grandeur of the event which is drawing the person to do it. But the small events that no one knows about, that no one sees, they were clearly done with purity. And they testify that even the big events were done with purity of motive. Where do you see this? You see this elsewhere. A famous Rashi in Shmos. Rashi says in the beginning of Shmos, "Vayom melech Mitzrayim la'miyaledus ha'ivris hashem shem ha'achas shifra v'shem hashenis pua." Famous episode where the 2 Jewish midwives saved the day, Shifra and Pua. Says Rashi, who were they? Says Rashi famously that they were none other than Miriam and Yocheved. Says Rashi, Shifra zu Yocheved, al shem shemeshafreres es avlad. She was beautifying the child. As the child emerged from the mother, she would swaddle the child, clean the child, and make sure that the child was well presented and beautiful. And then Pua, says Rashi, zu Miriam, that is referring to Miriam. Shepoya medaberes v'hoigel levlad. She would sort of coo to the child and hold the child kaderech hanoshim amifaises tinek haboiche, like a woman would do with a child that is crying. Of course, the question is asked: why not call them Yocheved and Miriam? Why does the Torah give them code names, Shifra and Pua? Just if they are indeed Yocheved and Miriam, just call them Yocheved and Miriam. So the answer is the same, because of course, and moreover, if you're writing the headlines of the paper, you wouldn't write Shifra and Pur. You'd write that they, what their greatness was. They saved the Jewish children, despite the threats of Paroi to anyway of destroying all the children. They risked their lives and they saved the Jewish children. So isn't that a sign of their greatness? Surely their risking of their lives is the greatest epitaph. The answer is that actually not, because perhaps when a person is doing a very public and well-known thing, then you're not doing it for the right motives. But what a person does in the privacy of their own home, away from the limelight, away from the camera, then if you're doing that with purity of motive, that is megala, that dictates, that shows that everything you're doing in public is also for the right motives. And therefore the Torah highlights what they did in private, what Yocheved did, that she would beautify the child, what Miriam did, that she would kuta the child, and that is their greatness. More, and we can see that them saving the Jewish children, which was the greater thing perhaps, was also done with purity of motive. And that is also borne out by a famous Gemara in Avodah Zarah. Take a look at the top of the next page. Tana Rabbanan. Kashechol Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma, when Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma took ill, Halach Rabbi Chanina ben Trajan levakre. Rabbi Chanina ben Trajan went to visit him. Omar Loi, it's unclear with the gear says who says to who, but let's say that Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma said to Rabbi Chanina ben Trajan, Chanina achi, don't you realize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has appointed the Romans to be in control of us? They've destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, they've burnt the temple, and they've killed the pious ones, and they've laid waste to the great ones. And Rome is still surviving and victorious. And yet I've heard about you, Rabbi Chanina ben Trajan, that you're still teaching Torah in public. And you're teaching Torah as if nothing's happening, and despite their decree that you can't do that. So Rabbi Chanina ben Trajan responded, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will have Rachmanas. So Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma said, I'm telling you some logical, sensible argument. Stop teaching Torah in the public. You're risking your life. And you're going to tell me that Hashem will have mercy. It's not going to have a happy ending. Now, then the conversation continues. So Rabbi Chanina ben Trajan says to Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma, what's going to be with me in the world to come? Am I going to get a chelik in haba? Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma said, not sure. Tell me anything particular happened to you. Can you tell me about some of the activities you've been involved in? Yeah, I'll tell you one virtuous thing that I've got. One time, I had some stock money, and I also had some my own Purim money, which I had the stock money was to give out to the aniyim, and I had my own money that I was going to use for Purim. And they got mixed up together. So v'chilaktim laniyim. I didn't know how much of the money was mine, how much was for stock, so I just gave the whole thing away. And I hadn't told any about this, and it was a secret. But you're asking me that. Let me tell you, that's one good thing that I did. I didn't estimate it. Maybe I'll make an error. So I just said, well, the whole lot will go to the aniyim. Omalei. So Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma said back to Rabbi Chanina ben Trajan, Kain. If that's the case, may your chelik in Olam Haba, halavai, I should get that chelik, and you'll get a big Olam Haba. Ad kan the story. Again, the same sort of question. Rabbi Chanina ben Trajan was really wondering, Ma ani lechai Olam Haba? Am I going to get Olam Haba? We just finished off saying he's risking his life to teach Torah in the public, despite the Roman decree against it. So of course he's going to get Olam Haba. That's a remarkable, mysterious nefesh. The answer is not necessarily, because public acts, maybe a person is not doing it for the right reason. Maybe there's kavod involved. Maybe it's the publicity of the event that's pulling you in. But then he tells him that I did something in private that no one else knew about. So then Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma says to Rabbi Chanina ben Trajan, if that's the case, that you're behaving with greatness in privacy, in the small, seemingly small acts, that indicates that even the great acts are done for the right motive. And this is really what Boaz saw in Rus. How so? See, the Gemara in Shabbos tells us that there were two amazing things that Boaz saw in Rus. Take a look at the next box. The Gemara says that when Boaz said to his lad there standing there, his attendant, "Who's that lady?" Says the Gemara in Shabbos, Kufit Gimel Beis v'Chidark Shaboaz Disha Benara. He's the head of the Sanhedrin. He's the Gadol Adar. He's asking about young ladies. Amar Bilazo Dava Chachma Rabba. No, he saw something of wisdom in her. What did he see? Shtei Shibadin Leketes, Shalosh Shibadin Ein Leketes. He saw that she knew the halacha, that if it was 2 sheaves, she could take them, but if it was 3, not, because then it's not shikha. Anything less than 2 or less, you can take them, you're allowed to, but if it's 3, the oni is not allowed to take them. So he saw a davar chachma. Furthermore, but Masnisa Tana, the Gemara continues, that a Brisa taught davar tznias rabba. Not only did he see chachma, but he saw tznias in her. That she collected the sheaves in a very tzanua way. That she sort of bent in a way which was tzanua, that her clothes were properly covered, and it was in a very modest way. So you see that it was Rus's private contact, her conduct away from the camera, which was the catalyst through which she was introduced to Boaz, culminating in their marriage and the royal future of Klal Yisrael. So you see exactly the same point. What did it? It was the acts of greatness done in private. And therefore, the second point that I'm making today is that you see that true greatness is how a person conducts himself in all of life's situations, big and small. And small is megale in the big. So that's point number 2. And we'll bring it together with point number 3. Because Perek Beis then continued and said, V'hinei Boaz bo mebeis lechem. Boaz comes along, v'yoyim el ha'kotzim, when he comes to the field where Rus happens to be harvesting, and he happens to come on that day, v'yoyim el ha'kotzim Hashem imochem, and he says to them, Hashem imochem, v'yoyim ulo, and they respond, Yivorechu Hashem. Now, the Gemara in Shabbos in Daled Amud Beis says the following, V'hiskinu she'ei odom shoel es shlem chaver b'shem. This interaction, this greeting that Boaz expresses in the beginning of Perek Beis was actually a landmark takana. How so? Says the Gemara in Shabbos that he instituted, as the head of the Sanhedrin, that you're allowed to greet another person with the Shem Hashem. Shenem avinu Boaz bo mebeis lechem v'yim al ha'kotzim Hashem mochem v'yom levrach Hashem v'oim Hashem chol gibor ha'chayil v'oim al tov, etc. V'oim eis las Hashem. What's going on? Says the Gemara in Makkas. This is Makkas Chaf Gimel Beis. Amr B'Shua ben Levi. Shleisha devarim also based in Shalmata v'skimu, based in Shalmal al Yodam. There were 3 occasions in history where the based in Shalmata made a decree, and the based in Shalmaila agreed with it. They vindicated it. Eluhein, and they lists what they are. One of them is She'elas Shalom B'Shem, that you're allowed to greet another person with the Shem Hashem. Now that was the takana, the institution that Boaz instituted. That they greeted other Jews with the name of Hashem properly. My v'omer. Why does it say v'omer a second? Why does it need to sort of give 2 expressions? Maybe you might think that Boaz did it off his own back, or and Shemaim didn't agree with him. Good. So you see that when Boaz came to the field, he greeted and he said, Hashem is with you. Hashem mochem, with the Shem Hashem. And he made this a takon of the Beis Din. The question is, why did Boaz institute this? What is this takon all about? Why now? What's going on? So the answer is this. Boaz saw a moral and a religious decline in the Jewish people. When did Megillas Rus take place? It takes place It takes place in the time of the judges. The Gemara says in Babasra, this is a time of, like I said, of moral and religious decline. The Gemara says in Babasra, Tesvav Beis, the next box, 3a, it was a generation where people judged its judges. For example, Omeloi told Kisem Bein Enecho, take the thorn from the splinter from between your eyes. Omeloi, in other words, you've got a small infraction, sort it out. The judges would tell the Baalei Din. Omeloi, and the Baalei Din would respond, told Korem Bein Enecho, but you've got a bigger infraction. Take the beam away from between your eyes. I.e., Shvot HaShoftim, the people were judging their judges. There was a moral decline, they were questioning authority. Furthermore, Rashi says in Megillas Rus in Perek Gimel that when Boaz slept in the field, and it says Halayla, that night he slept in the field. Why did Boaz sleep in the field? Shehadar Poretz B'Gneva, because that generation would steal. They were thieves. For Yoshin B'Geirona, Nishma Geirona, and Boaz had to sleep in his threshing floor in order to protect his harvest. So you see, the decay had sort of seeped into the Jewish people. And therefore, Boaz recognized that there's a problem here. So what did he do? He sees people not living with an awareness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in their lives. That's the problem. They're sort of just questioning authority. They're stealing. There's a problem going on here. They're thinking that HaKadosh Baruch Hu may reside in the Sanhedrin, but not in the field and not in the marketplace. And therefore, they're misunderstanding, as it were, the importance and the reality of life, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is everywhere. There's an amazing insight of Rabbi Menachem Liebtag that often I quote. It's an amazing, amazing insight. Sefer Vayikra, which of course when we complete Sefer Vayikra in the build-up to Shavuos, Sefer Vayikra is a book of two halves. Why? Because for the first 17 chapters, the whole theme of Sefer Vayikra is sort of Mishkan-centric. It's everything to do with the Mishkan. You have the beginning of Vayikra about all different types of karbonos. You have the rules of Kohanim. You have the Chanukas HaMishkan. You have deals of Tum and Tahara. The Avodah of the Kohen Gadol Yom Kippur. No karbonos outside the Mishkan. The first 17 chapters of Sefer Vayikra, all about the Mishkan. Then, from Perek Yud Ches, halfway through Achrimos, there's this sort of explosion of miscellaneous, a potpourri of all different types of different topics and themes. You have prohibited relationships, Kedoshim Tiyu, all different types of laws in Parshas Kedoshim, agricultural laws, the Menorah, the Shulchan, the capital punishment, Shemitah, Techocha, Erchin, a whole list. So how strange. The first half of Sefer Vayikra all about the Mishkan, the second half miscellaneous. And then, interestingly, the words Ani Hashem Elokeichem appear once in the first half of Sefer Vayikra in the first 17 chapters. And then, from chapter 18 onwards until the end of the Sefer, halfway through Achrimos, in this turning point, you have it no less than 3 times in the opening Pesukim of Perek Yud Ches, Vadaber b'nei Yisrael v'amart aleim ani Hashem Elokeichem, ani Hashem Elokeichem, ani Hashem, and then over 50 times until the end of Sefer Vayikra. It's striking. So why is it that it's a book of two halves? Why is Sefer Vayikra a book of two halves? Why is the first half all about the Mishkan, the second half miscellaneous? And why is it Ani Hashem Elokeichem appears only once in the first half of Sefer Vayikra and over 50 times from Perek Yud Ches until the end of the second half? The answer is, says Rabbi Menachem Liebtag, is that the message that the presence of Hashem is in the Mishkan, we don't need to be told that. Everyone knows that you go to shul on Shabbos morning, that's where religious practice is. That's obvious. And therefore I don't need to be told Ani Hashem Elokeichem when you're discussing the Mishkan and all related rules. But when you're discussing miscellaneous, outside of Mishkan, everything else, then we need to be told repeatedly Ani Hashem Elokeichem, that the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not limited to the Mishkan, but emanates into every aspect of our life. And that is what Boaz felt that the people of his time were not realizing, that they weren't living with the awareness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in their lives. And therefore, he instituted this seemingly strange takana, that I can greet you with the Shem Hashem, and his point in doing that is to instill an awareness that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is everywhere, and greatness can be seen in small acts of chesed, of keeping halacha, even in private. And that's really what's emerging from this whole picture, that we have to just bring HaKadosh Baruch Hu into every corner of our lives. And that's really the theme that emerges in Perek Beis of Sefer Rus. That, number one, it's not b'mikra. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is very much there. His puppeteering, his presence is felt everywhere. And Vayike Mikra, and then Vihine Boaz Bo. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is running the show. He's puppeteering history to sort of make it unfold in the way in which he wants. That's number one. Number two, true greatness is not just in the big things, but in the small things. In living a life where we live very much with HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence in everything we do, and that's the sign of real greatness. And it demonstrates that even the bigger things are done with the right motives. And that's really what Boaz sees in Rus. He sees that she's keeping halacha properly. She's sanua. The camera is not on her. She's a lone figure with no one apart from Naomi. She's got no one. She's in a field. She's harvesting a few sheaves of grain, and yet it's those small acts done with chachma and done with tznius that Boaz sees. And then Boaz wants to really rectify the shortfall of that generation. How does he do it? He does it by instilling them that people need to live with awareness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he therefore says, Hashem emochem, the HaKadosh Baruch Hu is with you. He's everywhere. Not just in the Sanhedrin, but in the fields. And that's why he chose to go to the field then, to instill this message outside of the Sanhedrin, in the field. And he wants to say that acts of greatness, even in small, keeping halacha and in behaving appropriately, recognizing that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is there, that's how we're going to rectify it. And that's exactly what he does. And therefore, that's Boaz's goal, therefore, was to instill this awareness that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is everywhere, and greatness can be seen even in the smallest acts. Like I say, we just have to bring HaKadosh Baruch Hu into every corner of our world. And that, to finish with, is really my favorite Shavuos idea, the Gemara in Pesachim, Samaches on the base. That the famous Gemara says that Rabbi Yosef b'yom ha'atzar ta'omar. Rabbi Yosef on the day of Shavuos would say, Eloi hayom d'kagarim kama Yosef ikabeshuka. Were it not for today, I'd be a regular Joe. There'd be many Yosefs in the shuk. Rav Ruderman says, really? You'd be a regular Yosef? Rabbi Yosef wouldn't be a regular Yosef. Clearly he was a highly intelligent and capable person. So he'd be a Professor Yosef, a Dr. Yosef, a CEO Yosef. What does it mean, Kama Yosef ikabeshuka? I'd be a regular Joe. The answer is this, says Rabbi Ruderman, that were it not for Matan Torah, I'd be a very fragmented, disparate individual. How I behave in the office is different to how I behave at home, which is different to how I behave on holiday, which is different to how I behave when I'm with my friends. But now I've got the Yom Tov of Shavuos, I've got Matan Torah, I've got a singular focus in my life. Everything I do has a consistency and a focus. And therefore, now that I've got Matan Torah, there's only one Rabbi Yosef. Kama Yosef Ika B'Shuka, I'm a fragmented person, I behave differently in different situations. But now I've got a single purpose in my life. I recognize that Kodesh Baruch Hu is everywhere, in all aspects of my life. That is really what Matan Torah is about. And that's exactly the point. That's what Boaz was trying to introduce here, when he was instilling the awareness that Kodesh Baruch Hu is everywhere, and the greatness can be seen in the smallest of acts. We just have to bring HaKadosh Baruch Hu into every corner of the world, and ultimately that will lead to the coming of Mashiach.